Welcome back to The Roll-Up. In today's episode, we had a good conversation with Andrew Young from SXBet. So our second podcast with Andrew. For this one, we focus strictly on the idea of prediction markets on-chain being the killer app for crypto. Andrew explained it quite well, as prediction markets are almost like the second iteration of crypto apps being popular, with the first one being these crypto native DeFi applications. We talked about their Appchain on Arbitrum Orbit, the future of sports betting on-chain, as well as Andrew's predictions for where this entire prediction market niche scales to in the next 5 years. We're pretty bullish on this idea. We enjoyed this podcast and hope you do as well. Let's jump right in after a quick word from our amazing sponsors.
Cartesia is your home for app-specific rollups. At the forefront of developing new tools and platforms that enhance the capabilities of blockchain technology, Cartesia enables applications that are flexible and built to scale. Build on a full Linux environment and use traditional software libraries, but in blockchain development. Go to cartesia.io, that's cartesia.io, to learn more about building your own app chain today.
Going on, guys? Welcome back to The Roll-Up. At ETHCC, we heard a lot of there is no apps and everything is infra. Today, we're going to debunk that thesis and talk about one of the biggest use cases we believe in, something that Rob's been pretty passionate about for some time, since the Augur days, which is the idea of prediction markets on chain. And I'd like to talk about some of the self-fulfilling prophecies. I saw Ansem getting arrested in 2024 odds. That's kind of a wild one when you start to put people's livelihood at stake on chain, and more. We're with Andrew from SXBet and longtime supporters and friends. Pass it over to you, Rob, GM. And what's up, man?
Yeah, GM. I'll keep my little rant here in the intro pretty short, because I think if I get going on prediction markets, I tend to go for quite a while. So yeah, self-fulfilling prophecy is something that I think is really fascinating about prediction markets. We'll probably get a little bit deeper into that and how markets can kind of like influence their own outcomes. Andrew obviously runs SX, which is firmly in the prediction market and betting market space, newly deployed on Arbitrum, and part of that LTIP program that's going on over there, which is a massive incentive program for a lot of projects on Arbitrum, SX included. Andrew, I think it's at least your second time on the podcast, man. So welcome back.
Yeah, happy to be here. I think I was on with Sandeep maybe 2 or 3 years ago, back in the heyday of Polygon's DeFi surge. But yeah, happy to be here now that prediction markets and GambleFi and sports betting is really finally getting its moment in the sun.
Yeah, I mean, you foresaw this, but why do you think this is happening now? Obviously, the election plays a part in that. And generally, like, how do you see this? This is almost a 0 to 1 moment for crypto and blockchain apps. Now that they're getting recognized by normal-ish people, where do you think we go from? Like, what is happening now, and where do you think we go from here?
Yeah, totally. So for SX, we are focused squarely on the sports betting side. SX is a peer-to-peer betting exchange, so that kind of allows us to be classified as a prediction market, even though I would say like most of our users think of us as kind of like a more true sports betting platform. But I think, I think prediction markets is this thing that everyone's been talking about since quite literally the first white paper from like the Ethereum white paper. It was like the very first use case talked about by Vitalik, just because it's such an obvious, clear sort of industry that deserves disruption and sort of needs disruption. And that's particularly within like the sports and politics side. So I think a lot of it, so I talk a lot about this because we've been working on SX since 2019. Or I should say our launch was in 2019. So it's been a very long time. And I think there's a couple things that are kind of happening that is allowing prediction markets as well as like GambleFi and sports betting to really take off right now. The first is the infrastructure is finally ready. So when we first launched SX, back then it was called SportX, on Ethereum mainnet back in March 2019, it was really bad UX. So users would have to, essentially use the Ethereum mainnet with incredibly slow block times. Bets cost like a couple dollars in transaction fees, and then at the same time, like people were not used to using MetaMask or other types of wallets. There's actually no other wallets at the time. MetaMask was the only one. I remember at the time when Bitski was kind of like the very first one to come out with a competitor. That was like really big news. And then let alone there was no real like inbuilt fiat on ramps. So things like MoonPay didn't exist. And if they did exist, it was like $20, $30 fees. It was just it was insane. Like, to be honest with you, I don't know why we built, at the time, you had to have a lot of like conviction in the space getting more usable, because it was very far from being usable back then. So all of those things are no longer true though. So you now have inbuilt wallet, fiat on ramps. You have much cheaper, much more scalable chains infrastructure. We have like 100 different L2s at this point. You have Solana. You have all sorts of new L1s that are exciting. And then finally, you also just have like a larger pool of on-chain users already. Back in 2019, the biggest DApp in the world, I think, was IDEX, which had like 800 daily active users. Now there's like millions of on-chain users every day. So I think like it's just like all the infrastructure and the sort of tech has finally caught up to the use case. And that's why I think we're kind of like about to see a further explosion in prediction markets and sports betting. I think prediction markets is really taking off right now just because of it's like a really good time in terms of politics. But I actually think, and obviously that's like how we built our company, I think the bigger explosion long term is actually going to be sports betting, just because like sports betting completely dwarfs politics betting, just given the fact that politics only happen, like big US elections only happen every 4 years, whereas there's thousands of matches every day. So I think it's like finally our moment in the sun for prediction market and GambleFi more broadly.
Yeah. Yeah, I also think that the world is just like getting slightly more degenerate. Like after COVID kind of set a way of life for people, I think, in a way. And so I think that the world also is just getting more speculative. I think like the zero interest rate phenomenon kind of has led to more people just taking speculative behavior to the max. But like, I guess to pose a question on you with regards to strictly prediction markets outside of sports betting and kind of get your take on this. Are prediction markets on chain? Is this like one of the best use cases for blockchain technology? Like when I think of on chain use cases, I think of blockchain and when people are asking me like, okay, what app do I build? I often think like, okay, think of a industry which has some sort of arbitrary middleman or third party, which effectively solves two people's problems or two people's coordination or arbitration of a result, and then just put a blockchain in there, make some smart contract rules, and tell both players of the game the rules, and then open up the floodgates for everybody. And I feel like prediction markets are almost like a perfect way of kind of opening this kind of I don't know what the analogy is when they say Pandora's box. So sports betting, prediction markets, like, is this like idea of like opening up markets for anything? Is this something that you believe that blockchains have been one of the killer use cases that we're kind of opening up now? And kind of, if so, maybe can alliterate or like add on to kind of why.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So I think prediction markets sit firmly in the second phase of crypto blockchain app adoption. So, and I can get into why, but so the first phase was essentially internal blockchain apps. So what I mean by that is, like something like Uniswap only really exists within the like context of crypto natives and like people who are already using the blockchain, because it allows you to swap tokens between blockchains or swap tokens in general, or just broader DeFi, which is essentially like, in a way, it's like its own like completely self-enclosed financial system, but it's not at all related to like the outside world, right? So It's kind of like it's fully its own self-enclosed thing. Prediction markets are kind of the second phase, where it's a combo of kind of like part of this self-enclosed system and also obviously part DeFi, but then also has elements of like general purpose consumer crypto. And then I think obviously the next phase is like just pure consumer crypto. So things like, social media or like on-chain video games, things like that, which I think are kind of like still, people are getting really excited about them, but they're kind of like still not there. So I think this is like this hybrid role of prediction markets is part of the reason why, where it's like, it's part consumer crypto, but also part DeFi in a lot of ways, is why it's been able to start to like take off and sort of being cited. With that being said, like prediction markets are still very small relative to like the total amount of users trading meme coins, for example, right? So like that first phase of adoption of like this whole self-enclosed DeFi ecosystem is still far bigger than anything in the prediction market world, as well as anything in the consumer crypto world. But yeah, I think like I would just say like I guess like the hybrid nature of prediction markets allows that. And one other thing too is prediction markets, they have lower average transaction sizes than traditional DeFi, like traditional DeFi applications. So like your average prediction market bet for example, for SX, it's about $100 to $200. Whereas like the average swap size on Uniswap, can easily be thousands of dollars, tens of thousands, or even hundreds of thousands of dollars. I should say even millions of dollars. Whereas like that doesn't really, there's some really big bets in prediction markets, but they're, for the most part, they're much smaller. And so that also is part of the reason why it's taken longer for prediction markets to kind of take off, is that it's only really in the last 2 years with the, launch of like Polygon, Solana, all this like wave 2 of very fast smart contract chains that you can even like have a mainstream prediction market take off. Yeah.
Well, then real quick, Andrew and Robin, I'm sure you've got a ton. Just one last thing on the prediction market side for Poly Market. If you're more bullish on sports betting than you are on prediction markets for politics in particular, or just in general, because of the cyclical nature of sports betting, Poly Market has sports betting, but it's not nearly used as much, like to the degree of like 1/10 or 1/20th as much as their politics or their other random prediction markets. Does that defeat your thesis, or is there another reason as to why that their sports betting offerings haven't gotten as much attention as their kind of more, I guess, degen-ish offerings?
Yeah, I mean, like without getting too much into Polymarket, but I think Polymarket is very much designed as a prediction market platform. So just like, for example, everything's quoted in cents out of 100. That is a very, like, there's almost no sports betting platforms in the world with a UI that looks like that. It's just, so for example, their UI is very different. Their target market's very different. For the most part, from what I can tell, Polymarket's done an incredible job of getting predicted traders onto their platform. So predicted is like this like centralized prediction market. The only issue is that there's a cap on the amount that you can sort of trade. So like there's like an $850 cap when you use predicted, whereas obviously Polymarket is has no cap. So that's like a huge edge. And from what I sort of gather, again, I'm obviously on the SX side, not Polymarket, but I think like they've done a good job of sort of attracting those like political traders. I think sports is like a much bigger, like much more competitive market, but it is the bigger prize, at least in my opinion. I think it's like the bigger, more sustainable, more and also just like better market to be disrupted. That does mean it takes like longer to build things towards it, though. SX does do, like, we're just about to hit $500 million in bets. Like we are starting to do, we now also have the best odds in the world for pre-game MLB, NBA, and NFL. So we've sort of achieved that milestone in the last 4 months. So that's across not just like crypto sports books like Stake and Rollbit, but actually across like traditional sports books like FanDuel, DraftKings, all those types of platforms. And that's taken like a long time to obviously build. And so, yeah, I just think like it's very early days in like the on-chain GambleFi space, which is kind of like, I would say a little bit different than on-chain prediction markets in terms of its focus. And I think it's going to have like a crazy surge in growth. Just like one last thing that's kind of interesting, on-chain GambleFi usage, or in terms of, I should say in terms of revenue, is like roughly like 20 to 25 basis points of the centralized crypto betting revenue of like something like stake and rollbit. So what I mean by that is essentially on-chain GambleFi is very similar to like 2019 levels of DEX trading. When at the time Uniswap was like 0.25% of the volume of Coinbase. That's essentially where we are right now with on-chain GambleFi. So to me, it's like, I think there's a very similar surge because I think now Uniswap does about 35% of Coinbase's daily volume. So I think there's like a similar like 100x increase in relative market share coming for sports betting. And I think like political prediction markets is kind of like the first sign of that.
Yeah, there's kind of like two paths that we can take this podcast, and I kind of want to take both. But since we're in the sports betting like path now, I'm curious, as there's one hypothesis as to why sports betting hasn't taken off on Polymarket. I'm curious if you are facing a similar phenomenon on SX, and it's that on a traditional sports book like DraftKings, FanDuel, those sorts of things, you're betting against the house. And so there's always someone there to take the other side of your bet. But on Polymarket, and I think it's the same on SX, you have to source both ends of liquidity. And so what you end up seeing is like really thin order books on prediction market sports because, well, a lot of times it's like a lot of the money is just coming in on one side, and then you don't have a house to take the other side. And so you're not able to match make a lot of those orders. That results in thin liquidity and not great prices and, yada, yada, yada down the line. Centralized sports books, off-chain sports books don't have that problem. So I'm curious, like when you're thinking about like, especially some long tail sports events, maybe like, the Olympics is going on right now. How do you guys think about sourcing liquidity for some of those long tail sports markets?
Yeah, so that is actually a really good question. That's kind of like, that's like hitting the nail on the head. So for us, like we have a network now of over 50 market makers that we sort of like painstakingly introduced into on-chain sports betting over the years. And that was kind of just like a traditional BD process, just getting them, familiar, excited, and sort of understanding and like integrated into the platform. So with that being said, though, you are totally right. The long tail of sports betting is very tough to source liquidity. And that's actually not necessarily specific sports. It's actually more things like player props or sort of like exotic markets of like very popular sports. So like player props is like, will LeBron score 30 plus points today? That one would actually be a bit more popular, so it would probably be somewhat easy to get liquidity, but like, will LeBron get 4.5 rebounds or more or less tomorrow? Those are very tough to source liquidity, and they're also more inefficient. So what that means is they're much harder to provide liquidity for, because as a market maker, you're sort of at an inherent disadvantage, because like, if some news comes out that LeBron's injured or someone else on the team's injured, then there's a ton of ways to like hit people's liquidity, like what's called fast clicking. We call that fast clicking in sort of the prediction market world, and take people's offers before they can sort of lift them. So for us, we're very focused on like the main sports and the main markets within those sports. And then our idea is like, as we add more market makers, we slowly scale into those other markets. It definitely takes a little bit longer, but there's really no reason that you shouldn't have better liquidity on those things as well, just because of like the way a betting exchange or prediction market works, right? Like you can have multiple people providing liquidity versus just like the house. So, and then finally, one last thing, like I should really mention this, the liquidity on a lot of these sports books for those long tail events is very illusory. So what I mean by that is if you actually take that liquidity and consistently win, those sportsbooks will ban you what's called limit you very quickly. So they'll essentially lower your max bet to like an insignificant amount, like say like $2. And in some cases, like they'll actually just like steal your money as well, steal your balance or prevent you from withdrawing, which is essentially the same thing. And it's particularly egregious for those small markets because it's easier to essentially identify people who are positive EV or essentially consistently profitable, or the DeFi term toxic flow, when you're betting those like more esoteric markets. So yeah, I would say like overall, we still have some work to do to catch up there, but I think we're taking like a very like disciplined approach, starting with the big sports and then just working downwards. And we actually just recently launched peer-to-peer parlays, for example, which I think is the first peer-to-peer parlay betting system in the world, where essentially parlays, for example, is when you combine multiple bets into like one mega bet. And previously, betting exchanges never had that because it's such an esoteric type of market. Whereas we created this essentially like almost like RFQ system where you can request a quote for a market, and we build like a private order book in real time, and then market makers can submit their best bids. And so, yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is we're going to eventually build all that way to the point where, you'll have same game parlays, but it'll be unlimited liquidity instead of limited.
You guys are not the only ones working on this problem, right? And this sort of like liquidity sourcing problem pops up in a lot of places. Like you guys are primarily looking at it through the lens of sports and same game parlay, even down, I've seen some of these micro betting platforms all the way down to like the snap, right? Is this play going to be a pass or a run? Or is this guy going to hit this free throw? Or is this guy going to make this putt? All the way down to like the play level. But we see this same problem in a different form in prediction markets, where it's like, well, is this thing going to happen? Is this thing going to happen? Very esoteric markets where not a lot of people are paying attention. How do you source liquidity for that? And then more generally, like we've spoken with Arjun from Connext and now Everclear, who are looking at this problem from like a bridging perspective. And it's like, well, how do you get solvers, which are basically liquidity providers, to provide liquidity on some of these long tail chains? And the solution that they've come up with is almost like this clearinghouse method, where you're trying to look at everyone who's looking at one side, everyone who's inflows on one side, outflows on the other side, and kind of find the coincidences where you have both of those match up. And for like a sport, just to bring it back to the sportsbook analogy, like, if you guys had a way of reading the flow of orders from DraftKings, from, all of the on-chain sources, and then you could kind of like aggregate that and match that and clear that against flow coming from the other side, I feel like it would overall be a much more efficient market. And so I'm curious if you're like, how are you? Because I think one thing that, and I'll close up this rant now. One thing that a lot of people want but can't have right now is permissionless markets, permissionless market listing, where if I have an idea of something that I want to predict, I can just type it in, and then all of a sudden it's a market on the UI and people can come bet on it. But again, that is like esoteric to infinity. How do you get market makers to provide liquidity to some market that I just thought about on a whim?
Yeah, so there's two things there I want to address. So I'll talk about the second part in a second. But I think first of all, in terms of like the idea of like having all the flows in one spot, that's actually the vision of SX, is to build effectively like this global liquidity hub for sports betting. Because if you look at the sports betting world right now, it's a highly fragmented, effectively like thousands of different like closed pools of liquidity where there's no data in any of the flows, completely proprietary. There's really hard to like connect these different flows of liquidity. Like there's some aggregators that have been built, but for the most part, it's like quite limited. SX is actually about to get added onto one of the biggest aggregators in the world for this, which is pretty cool. We'll be the first crypto sports betting platform on that. but still, it's still like it's very different than like what dexes are right now. And then finally, like you said, like it's not permissionless, it's completely closed source. Like it's just not, it's like the most non-DeFi thing you can find, put it that way. And so like our vision is to essentially build this like global liquidity hub for on-chain sports betting. And that really is kind of like the vision and goal of it. And by doing that, we can essentially lower the VIG from the industry standard of 5 to 7% down to less than 50 basis points, so less than 0.5%. And like that's effectively the goal of SX, is to drive like a 15, 20x decrease in the cost of transacting when you're trading sports. In a lot of ways, like SX is kind of like an institutional betting exchange. In a lot of ways, just because, or institutional liquidity hub for sports betting. But anyways, on your second point on the permissionless markets, so everyone wants to create whatever market they want, but no one wants to provide liquidity on it. So that is like the core issue with a lot of these markets. It's part of the reason why we haven't really dived too deeply into that. I also think like Polymarket's doing a pretty good job there. They sort of get around it by subsidizing it. So they essentially, I think they spend like something like 15 to 20K a day. That's what I was seeing from, I think, Sisyphus, something like that, of like of incentives per day to reward market makers to provide liquidity. That's like, it's somewhat expensive. I think a lot of it goes to like US elections and stuff, but that's actually a pretty good way of getting people to provide liquidity. It obviously comes with a cost. I don't think Polymarket charges a fee right now. So like eventually, like long term, you have to have some sort of like, value accrual there to sort of like, you can't just subsidize it forever and not charge fees. So yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is I think it's a bit of an unsolved problem. Like in the short term, you can kind of throw subsidies at it, but like eventually you need to actually solve for it in like a sustainable way. Another issue with permissionless markets is as soon as you start getting beyond sports and even to a certain extent politics, you start to get into this issue where it's unclear how to actually resolve these markets. You can kind of have like ambiguous settlement. And that's even true even if you like decentralize it and use something like Yuma, for example. I think like what Yuma is doing is really, really cool. It's probably the best sort of best possible strategy to try to like solve decentralized like the decentralized Oracle problem. I'm sure you guys have had like Hart and the Yuma guys on your podcast, so don't need to go too much into that. But it's still like even if you have like a good decentralized model for it, it's still like a very, I would say, almost potentially unsolvable problem for these types of like permissionless esoteric markets. I think there's some things that are kind of interesting though with that. Some people are trying to use AI to solve that. Like essentially like you outsource market creation and reporting to like an AI or ChatGPT. It's still very early there. And yeah, who knows if that will work. But I guess what I'm trying to say is like, it's a very thorny issue getting into these like permissionless markets. And so we're just very focused on like the markets that we know there's demand for and that we know that will work. And that we just know that the current industry is just like not at all up to par with like the standards that we're all used to in DeFi.
Mantle is a layer 2 blockchain with one of the biggest on-chain treasuries in all of crypto, and they have a 100-day campaign called Metamorphosis live now. What this is it is a campaign for their liquid staked ETH token, METH, as well as their upcoming liquid restaking token, CMETH, where you can utilize this token on the Mantle network in a variety of different apps, some of your favorite restaking protocols and DeFi protocols, and earn yields in the form of powder, which will eventually be turning into a governance token. Mantle's been around for a while. We like them because they use their own form of EigenDA. They have a good ecosystem and they're growing. So check out this 100-day Metamorphosis campaign and hope you guys enjoy the rest of this video.
A good example of just like even from today, I think Polymarket had like prediction markets on the Venezuela election in terms of like Nicolas Maduro. Who like by all accounts it looks like he just like rigged the vote to win. So like that would be a very thorny thing to try to figure out how to report, because
Yeah.
it's like, did he win or did he just, like, I guess he won, but he kind of cheated. So like, does it count? You even have that a little bit with sports, even like, for example, over the weekend, Max Verstappen, he won qualifying for the F1 Formula One race. But then like after the fact was given a grid penalty. And so like he didn't actually start in pole position on Sunday. He actually started, I think, like 11th. So you have that a little bit with sports. I guess that's actually one other thing that sort of separates how we built our site versus a lot of these other prediction markets. So SX is built in a way where we can actually effectively void So when we void markets, it actually unwinds trades and completely. So the way to think about that is SX only allows like primary trading on contracts, which is very different than Polymarket or Gnosis or these other like prediction market sort of templates, which allow secondary trading. So like you're actually trading a token that represents the event, not trading into the event directly.
Yeah,
it's a very like technical aspect, but the difference is that when we report markets as a void, people get back exactly what they put into the bet. Whereas this other design, there's no ability to do that. Like you can't unwind trades perfectly. So everyone gets back like 50 cents on the dollar, which doesn't really work, because like if you bet on a huge if you bet on a huge favorite and then like the match gets canceled and you only get 50 cents back, you actually lost a lot, because you might have paid like 90 cents for the bet. Yeah. And then now you only get 50. So it kind of distorts things a little bit. But again, we don't have to get too much into that. It's kind of like a technical sort of aspect of how, but again, like that's just sort of like how we went. Our design is definitely more tailored for sports betting than for anything else.
I think even with sports, like I think one of the most valuable aspects of prediction markets is the arbitration of truth. Like, Max Verstappen, and it's a mild example, right? The Venezuelan president, prime minister example is like one with like much more drastic consequences. But we live in an age with like so much information overload from both sides, and everyone is biased. And it's like, well, who knows what to believe? But when you have a market that almost necessitates an outcome, it's like, well, there are people incentivized to come to some consensus as to like what the truth of the matter is.
I think that aspect of prediction markets is really cool. Like the fact that it produces this public good, which is the information itself. Yeah. So I think that part is really good. I think the part that needs to be solved for is like the economic, like someone needs to pay for that public good. So like it's going to be yeah. I mean, I actually don't know the answer to it. But I definitely agree. I think like the public good aspect of like prediction markets is really cool. And I think it makes a lot of sense, particularly for like politics and things like that, just because people want to bet on it for fun even. It starts to get hairier when you get into like very esoteric prediction markets where like you as a market maker, the only people who are going to be betting against you are people who have superior information. Like there's no noise traders or whatever you want to call them, like people just betting on things for fun. It's just like, in a way, it's almost like pure toxic flow. And so in a market with just like pure toxic flow, where the only way to really survive as a market maker is to provide liquidity with like really wide spreads. So yeah, I mean, I think like, again, though, I don't think that sort of applies to things like politics and sports and some other types of markets, maybe some pop culture things as well. So yeah.
Everclear is pioneering the clearing layer. The clearing layer can almost be thought of as Splitwise when you go on a trip with friends, but for the blockchain. What I mean by that is when users are sending cross-chain messages, there's oftentimes fillers and solvers who have balances left on different chains that they need to rebalance and reset their positions. This is where Everclear comes in. Everclear is pioneering a collaborative approach to the chain abstraction future, and they are willing to work with interoperability partners, solvers, and other providers in the space to build a interoperable and chain abstraction future. Check out Everclear at everclear.org and Welcome back to the Rollup. Covalent is solving the long-term data availability problem where a lot of the data availability providers today in the modular space, when you post data to them, they actually only hold that data for about 12 to 16 days. And then it's basically, they can go into an archive node, or oftentimes it's just kind of put away into the abyss. And what Covalent's trying to do is build this long-term data availability solution, which can plug into some of these modular data availability providers and provide this longer-term perpetual data solution. So what we try to think of this as is when you post transaction data onto Celestio or Veil or any of these modular DA solutions or even Ethereum, Covalent is able to provide a long-term data storage and data availability platform for that data after the time period. Blockchains are billboards, not databases, and we need these providers in the space to be able to kind of hold on to the long-term data that is provided from these providers and these blockchain state. This is where Covalent comes in. They just had a nice rebrand. Check them out on Twitter as well as the website. Thank you for being here. Hope you enjoy the rest of the show.
One of the things I'm most proud about for SX is the fact that recently we just had our best Q2 ever in terms of betting volume as well as users. And at the same time, we had just cut liquidity incentives to zero about halfway through the quarter. And so to me, that was our strongest signal yet, that we've kind of achieved a measure of product market fit where there's no, we essentially don't have to subsidize market makers anymore. And if anything, actually our volumes just grown since then. So yeah, I guess to answer your question, initially we did subsidize liquidity on the SX betting exchange through this thing, like I said, called bet mining, where essentially, users that traded on the platform or offered liquidity earned SX tokens. But again, that's now effectively been discontinued. So I think that's probably one of the most bullish things about what we've done. In terms of what SX token what the tokenomics, all that type of stuff. So there's two things. So one is SX is a bit unique in the sense that we're actually also our own rollup, which I'm sure you guys are going to want to talk about as well, because we've been chatting about it offline for a while. But so in one sense, SX is a traditional L2 token where sequencer revenue, all sorts of all the revenue from essentially being its own rollup can go to the token. So I think that's one aspect of it. And then the second is obviously it is a betting exchange as well, both the app and the sort of underlying protocol. And so right now SX doesn't charge a commission, but has in the past, and it's up to the community, but it could easily happen in the future. And so that would be one obvious sort of source of value accrual for the token. I think it makes sense to have some sort of fee structure that allows SX to sort of maintain its superior liquidity without compromising on that. But yeah, I would say that those are kind of the two big things. And then there's also a staking element. There's governance. A lot of the kind of basics of any real DeFi project.
Yeah, let's definitely dig into the roll-up part of that. Because you guys have flow, whether it's toxic or not, and maybe we can decipher what that means. You guys are also in a position where you can internalize that revenue, similar to how these other blockchains that maybe have some trading functionality, they're graduating in their Appchain lifecycle. They're going from apps that are built on a general purpose rollup, launching their own Appchain so that they can kind of internalize a lot of the sequencing and MEV that they otherwise would have leaked to a ecosystem layer. And so you guys have taken an Appchain approach from a very early stage. And that comes with a ton of trials and tribulations. Like you said, we've talked about these, offline. When you guys think about those, walk us through that. And then I definitely want to, take most of the time to think where you guys are now and where you're headed, but briefly walk us through kind of where you've been in this Appchain life cycle, and what those trials and tribulations were.
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say we were extremely early to the Appchain like meta, whatever you want to call it. And that, like you said, it came with some challenges. So part of it is like SX was launched a very long time ago relative to like the vast majority of blockchain apps. We launched in March 2019 on Ethereum, and we ran into a lot of issues, obviously being on Ethereum mainnet. And those issues kind of came to a head during DeFi summer. That was back in like August 2020. That was kind of like right when, Compound launched their token, all these DeFi protocols started going crazy. And at the time, gas fees on Ethereum mainnet went from like 50 cents to, I think it was like $50 at one point. And so for us, where our average transaction size is $100, it effectively forced us to shut down the app. And so one, that was like kind of a scarring experience because like we had been building, a user base and a product, and essentially for reasons outside of our control, we had to effectively shut down the platform. And also like a lot of our users, we have some like crypto native users, but a very large percentage of our users are just like sports bettors who want good odds. They don't actually really care about the blockchain or crypto element at all. If anything, it's kind of like a small disadvantage that it's crypto based. Or just like a means to an end for them. So we essentially ended up launching on Polygon POS back in, I think, September, October 2020. I think we would have been like the first or second app on Polygon at the time. I actually think Polymarket was maybe the other one, as well as like an Aave fork. And that was amazing. It allowed us to scale pretty dramatically. Like our volume grew very dramatically in 2021 because like we now finally had like, it didn't cost like 50 cents or let alone $50 to place a bet. You could do it for free effectively. But then we ran into a lot of issues with Polygon POS as well. Again, this is sort of like back in the day. They've resolved, I would say, a good chunk of them, but there was a lot of issues with like network instability. It was a very sort of new chain at the time. It also began to see quite a dramatic increase in transaction cost as well when they hit their kind of like DeFi summer in, I would say, like February 2021. So transaction cost went from like fractions and fractions of a penny to like a couple cents, which was still like fine for us. But given that we had seen this story play out before, it worried us a lot. And so we kind of just realized that like if we wanted to build this platform sustainably long term, particularly because like a good chunk of our users is like sports bettors, not crypto natives, we realized we needed to have our own infrastructure. And so we started building that out back in like end of 2021. And at the time there was really only like two options. It was kind of Cosmos or a recently launched SDK called Polygon Edge. We decided to go with Polygon Edge just because we were already on the Polygon infrastructure. We were very familiar with their team. And it was also EVM compatible. I think like now people are finally starting to get EVM compatible Cosmos chains. I think Barrett chain is probably going to be the first kind of real one. But anyway, so we decided to do that. And so we ended up launching SX Network, which effectively is an app chain built on top of Polygon Edge. And that was great. That allowed us to, essentially scale our user base. We've never had any issues with infrastructure or far less issues. So I'm actually a really big believer in app chains, particularly if you've hit like a level of, I would say for two things. One, if you don't need a lot of crypto natives, it's particularly good because crypto natives don't care what chain they're on. They just want to use the app. And then second, if you're not like a DeFi platform that needs composability with others in the ecosystem, then it also makes sense. And so that was great. And the only issue is that while we were big fans of Polygon Edge, it seems like the Polygon team itself wasn't. And so they actually sunsetted the Polygon Edge SDK, I think probably about 8 months ago. They kind of went in a different direction, more into like the ZK EVM stuff. Polygon's a huge team, so they have tons of different, I think they have like 10 different things they're focusing on right now. And unfortunately, Polygon Edge, which I guess for people who don't know what Polygon Edge was, it was kind of like subnets it was like the Polygon version of subnets, if you've heard of like Avalanche subnets. Anyway, so we started to have issues 6 months ago. effectively kind of saw the writing on the wall. We're also having some issues with like, while there's big advantages to being on your own app chain, like I said, there is also huge disadvantages. The main disadvantage is you lose out on a lot of the distribution benefits of plugging into these other ecosystems, which for the most part are almost always going to be larger than your specific kind of like tailored one. And so we decided on kind of like a hybrid approach of, okay, we need to move off Polygon Edge. We definitely want our own kind of like permanent home. So we're gonna launch an Arbitrum Orbit rollup, and that's going to be where our power users and our like non-crypto native sports bettors transact. But then we're also going to build like SX Lite, which is like effectively like a lighter version of the app, and we're going to launch that cross-chain into other ecosystems, and that will allow us to still target the crypto natives, like the casual sports bettors who love DeFi, love using crypto, and still love sports betting, but then also have this like permanent home for the like professional sports bettors that kind of like power the whole platform. So long-winded way of saying essentially we're just in the final stages of migrating to this Arbitrum, the SX rollup, which is built on Arbitrum Orbit. And then we've also launched the SX app on Arbitrum 1, which is like, the L2 of Arbitrum. And we're targeting more chains to launch on that, which again, I can talk about as well. And so, yeah, it's really exciting for us because we kind of get the best of both worlds.
It's almost like you guys launched L4s. Like Ethereum's L1, Arbitrum's L2, SX is an app chain, which is like, it's on Arbitrum Orbit. So it's kind of like an L3. And then you have these SX Lite nodes of SX that, if I understand that correct, the setup correctly, it's like people can place orders on the SX Lite, but then it settles onto your L3, which is the app chain. Is that kind of like the right frame how this works?
Yeah, totally. So SX on SX Rollup is a true betting exchange. So it's fully peer-to-peer. When you use like the SX app on these other chains, it almost functions more like a sports book where you're betting against a contract. And what's happening on the back end is you're placing a bet against the contract on Arbitrum 1. And then that same contract is placing like a hedging bet on the like SX exchange on the SX rollup. So the contract is perfectly hedged effectively. Like it has, effectively it has a bet against you on team A, but then it's placed your bet for you. And so like at no point, and then essentially we just rebalance the pools over time. It's almost like a relayer model for betting. And it's super lightweight, so we can launch on other EVM chains relatively easily. Sports betting is very capital efficient. So that's one of the reasons why this type of model works. Because, it's not like cross-chain lending would be a huge lift because, if I'm doing I'm taking out a $5 million loan for multiple years, like that requires a ton of TVL and it doesn't generate that much transaction volume or fees. Whereas sports betting, like people turn over their accounts like 50 times a year. And like for the most part, open interest only is there for a couple hours. That's actually why you often see like prediction markets typically have very low TVL, but they'll have like very high transaction volume and extremely high like revenue or fee capture relative to that volume. It's like one of the most capital efficient sort of sectors of DeFi. But it doesn't generate a lot of TVL because like these an NBA game only lasts a couple hours, right? So, and then that money leaves, and so that it leaves the TVL metric. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is sports betting is like this perfect use case where you can do this kind of like crazy cross-chain transacting, and it's still like fully economic, and it makes sense.
Yeah, and I love how like the sports betting industry and you guys specifically have been able to front run a lot of the problems and like challenges that we're seeing on like DeFi in general. And I think that's like been true of sports betting for a long time. It's like, this is a market and these guys are incentivized to like innovate this market. And so you guys, you see a lot of innovation happen on sports books before it happens on Wall Street. You see it happen in prediction markets before it happens in DeFi in general. And so one of these things that we've been trying to solve in DeFi for a long time is like cross-chain composability and like cross roll-up transactions. So you guys are doing this with a relayer model. And so you're able to kind of like bring together this multi-chain experience into like a single roll-up settlement network, which is the SX rollup app chain. But you can tap into liquidity and users and network effects from a lot of different chains, like Arbitrum One, like Polygon, and so on and so forth. And so, two-part question. First, if you could please shout out just like where you have these implementations so that people know like where they can find you. But then second part is like, is a much more difficult question. So like how, and is it possible to turn a regular sports book, maybe even an off-chain sports book, into like a relayer? Like how do we get like DraftKings flow on chain? And we don't need like the actual dollars, right? We just need to relay the orders so that you know to rebalance a certain way. And like, is that possible? If so, like how doable is that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I guess just first of all, we're SX is only on 2 chains right now. So the SX rollup, which has full functionality, which includes like live betting, parlays, everything, and then Arbitrum One, where it's more limited. It's just pre-game betting. We're going to launch cross-chain live betting at some point, as well as parlays, sort of in the upcoming months. And then there's some ecosystems that we're really excited about. So our kind of vision is that we're probably heading towards a world where like consumer crypto apps, things like that, are probably going to have their own chain, I think, to a certain extent. And then, but then there's still going to be these like maybe like 10 to 20, I could be wrong, there could be like hundreds, but like 10 to 20 like mega all-in-one generic L1s and L2s. And so our cross-chain strategy is really to kind of like predict one is like see which ecosystems are obviously big, but then more importantly, we want to predict which ones we think are going to get big, because we think a lot of the alpha in terms of being like a chain DApp is to actually be like really early into new chains that are exciting, and sort of like building with the community, almost being like what we call being a day one app. And so so there's some ecosystems that we're really excited about, like Bearchain, I think is really cool. I think like a Cosmos EVM chain that actually works is awesome. Bearchain is really exciting. Cosmos EVM chain, proof of liquidity, doesn't really isn't as important for us, but I think is really cool too. I think they're gonna have a really incredible DeFi ecosystem. Monad is really cool as well. I think like a 10,000 TPS. They've built a great community. There's a lot of hype as well, of course. So I think that's like another sort of L1 that we're sort of monitoring. On the L2 side, I think Scroll is quite interesting. It's kind of like one of the first like ZK chains that's really growing well. And they don't even have like their token out, which like to me means like, you know, it's just more growth coming. I think like what the Mode guys are doing is actually really, really interesting as well. So like James from Mode is doing this like really like targeted go-to-market approach, kind of similar to like what Blast is doing in some ways, but giving even more support. So anyways, that's kind of like a long-winded way of saying those are different chains that we're sort of monitoring about potentially launching on, as well as like the main ones like Polygon POS and things like that. On your second question, which is the sort of more complex of the two, like how do you bring DraftKings flow on chain? It's very tough because DraftKings and all these different sports books, they are not open. So what I mean by that is virtually none of them have APIs. They don't want you to actually have access to their data, let alone like their flow data. That's pretty much impossible to get. Two is it's not liquidity in the sense that me and you think about liquidity. Like it's not like permissionless liquidity like Uniswap, right? Like this is very siloed liquidity. So what I mean by that is like me and you could see different liquidity when we go to DraftKings based on who they essentially profile every user, and you effectively have a score And as you win, or if you even lose, but like you're taking what are seen as good bets, your score essentially gets reduced. And so they lower your betting limits and vice versa. So the opposite. So if you're like blowing through tons and tons of money and losing, your limits actually increase, which is like a very predatory system. So I guess like overall, it's not really, it's like a kind of impossible flow to actually get access to. And this is part of the reason why sports betting is so inefficient, I think. And so I think like, I guess to answer your question, I don't know if that's actually kind of the goal of what we're trying to do, is to access like their liquidity or their flow. We're in some ways, we're kind of doing the DeFi approach of like building this like new system of like completely permissionless liquidity and far more transparency, far more security, and just making the bet that that's going to grow and grow over time because it's just simply a better system. And then eventually, if it grows enough, like, you know, off-chain traditional sports books will need to hook into that liquidity if they want to sort of compete. So I would say in a lot of ways, it kind of mirrors DeFi in terms of building like a parallel universe that doesn't really touch that much between them. Yeah, I mean, if you look at DeFi, like we still don't have tokenized stocks. You know what I mean? Like, DeFi is where you go to trade Popcat. It's not where you go to trade Apple. And maybe Popcat or whatever meme coin doesn't grow to be as big as Apple, but like in aggregate, you know, that ecosystem like might begin to rival like the traditional markets. And then maybe at some point there'll be a crossover. But so yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is very similar to DeFi in that regard.
Yeah, I'm curious, Andrew. Kind of last thing from my end with regards to your like the SX rollup. Why did you guys end up going with Arbitrum Orbit and not a different rollup stack?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So Arbitrum to us. So first of all, we wanted one of our big requirements was we wanted like a battle tested system. Like we have migrated too many times, so this was kind of like our last migration we were ever going to do. You know, we went from Ethereum to Polygon POS to SX network built on Polygon Edge, and then we're going to a roll up. Like, I can't do any more migrations. This is the last one. So we wanted something that had been battle tested, you know, that was like kind of consensus, that was kind of like people had already built L2s and rollups using it, and like it functions really well. And so we did a lot of research and talked to a lot of teams, and definitely checked those boxes. Second is we needed extremely fast like block times. So it's going to have like a 250 millisecond block time that allows us to do cross-chain live betting as well as some other really cool things. It actually allows us to potentially do an on-chain order book as well, which is kind of like part of our roadmap. Is we want to figure out how to fully decentralize our order book. Right now, our order book is kind of similar to like DYDX, where it's like an off-chain matching system and then on-chain settlement, or I guess DYDX from before. So I think that like the just like performance was incredible. And then finally, like the Arbitrum team and I should say community has been incredibly supportive. So we were lucky enough to get like one of the LTIP grants for the launch of SX on Arbitrum 1. We're now, I think, the largest GambleFi project on Arbitrum 1, which is pretty cool. And a big part of that was just like the support of the Arbitrum community, as well as like the grant, as well as just like, you know, co-marketing and all that type of stuff. So I just think the Arbitrum team's it's been really great to work with, and the community's been very supportive. And so we use Arbitrum for DA, and as well. Yeah, I think it's been pretty seamless. So yeah, it's been good.
Awesome, man. I don't have much else from my end. I think that was pretty comprehensive from prediction markets. We covered the entire stack from app all the way down to infra. So Andrew, thanks for coming on again, man. And I know this is the second time, it's a couple of years in between, but I know you're still getting started. We're still getting started. So we'll hopefully we'll see you again, you know, on camera in public and on podcast within another couple of years.
Sounds good, guys. Yeah, and I love the podcast, and great to see you guys grinding away, and way bigger audience this time around than I think it was 3 years ago. So congrats on congrats on all the success. And yeah, see you again soon.
Yeah,
Sounds
thanks,
good, man.
Andrew. It's been a pleasure.